Let me take you back in time, almost 20 years ago, 1997 to be exact. I'm sitting in Miss Schaefer's English 101 class and have been told to write an essay entitled, "Why My Future Will Be Different from My Parents." I still have this essay. In it, I write about how I think my future will be very different from my parents, but most of all different from my mother's. I write about how my father, a supervisor on an oil rig, and mother, a housewife who homeschooled her 6 children, had a very simple but good life together, raising their family of 4 boys and 2 girls. I write about how I could never be tied down like that. I could never be satisfied being just a wife and mother. I wrote that my mother was a great mom, but truth be told, I believed I was a little too selfish to be a mother, or at least one like my mom. I wrote myself 10 years into the future with a degree in library and information sciences, living on the East Coast with no husband and no children. I had no driving desire to be a mother, and I thought I would be perfectly fulfilled without a child. 8 years passed, and I had that degree. But I was living in Louisiana, married to a great guy, but we weren't ready to have children until April of 2005. That's when my husband had to sit down and tell me that my 18-year-old brother had died. That year, we decided to quit preventing and see what happened. Grief made me somehow want to defy death and create life. A year or so went by and nothing happened. My husband was tested, and he was found to have a prostate infection, which, if you didn't know, has no outward symptoms, but causes deformed sperm with no tails and sometimes 2 heads. The infection was easily cured, but still, nothing happened. I told everyone, including myself, that it was okay. I didn't have to be a mom. I had a great job, wonderful friends, a husband I loved. I was fine. Fast forward to January of 2009. My dad was diagnosed with cancer, and 11 days later, my mother and I held his hands as he took his last breaths. For a few months, I did fine. But his death brought back my desire to create life. I decided to get tested and see if the problem was me. Turns out my hormones are a bit problematic, and I was told we would have to use fertility treatments to ever get pregnant. Grief got the best of me, and by summer, I didn't care about creating life or defying death. I didn't really care about anything, and I really didn't feel anything. The only thing keeping me going was the fact that I didn't want my mother to have to pick out yet another coffin. Then in November of that year, 2 weeks after my husband and I separated, I found out something had finally happened. I was 6 weeks pregnant. It took much longer to heal my marriage, which eventually happened, but there was something about creating a life that brought me healing. I had a purpose. I had an anchor, a compass, and by God, I had to get my act together because I was going to be responsible for another human being. I was not going to fail. I pulled myself out of the fog of my grief, and I began to find myself again. It is harder than anything I've ever done. I feel like a failure some days, and yet a triumph of motherhood other days. Becoming a mother and teaching a new little human how to enjoy his life has taught me that even with all the terrible things that happen to us, that life is beautiful, and we can't take that time for granted. My little human is now 5, and in the last 5 years, I've realized that I'm not all that different from my own mother. When I take the sunny side up egg that's a little too overdone and I give Liam the good runny one, I realize I'm not that different. When I stubbornly go toe-to-toe with him to prove my point, I realize I'm not that different. As I read bedtime stories, I remember my own mother reading to me as a child, and I realize I'm not that different. I realize how fulfilled my mother actually was being just a wife and mother. I thought my mother had no ambition, but what greater ambition is there than to raise decent, kind-hearted, good human beings? I'm not that different from my mother, and I've realized that's perfectly all right with me.